November 12th, 1941. Just before dawn. The Half Moon Hotel, Coney Island, Brooklyn. In room 623, 6 floors above the boardwalk, sleeps the most protected man in America. Abe Reles, 35 years old, the star witness whose memory has already sent killers to the electric chair, is guarded around the clock by a detail of New York police detectives stationed in the suite with him. He is, in every sense, inside the fortress. Hours from now he is due in court, where his testimony is the load-bearing wall in the case against one of the most powerful men in the American underworld. When the sun comes up, Abe Reles is lying dead on a lower roof of the hotel, several floors below his window. Knotted bedsheets dangle from the room above, tied off to a radiator. The official story arrives quickly. The witness died in a bizarre escape attempt. Almost nobody believes it, then or now. The sheets were too short. His body lay too far from the wall. He was a man awaiting leniency and protection, with nowhere to escape to. Decades later, Lucky Luciano's own published recollections would claim the answer plainly, that $50,000 had been spread among the guards. The underworld wrote the epitaph within a day, and it has never been improved on. He could sing, he just could not fly. Now, think about what that scene actually is. A marked man, a price on his head. A safe house that turns out to have no safety in it, because the organization hunting him has rules, reach, and money that go deeper than any protection. If that shape feels familiar, it is because you have watched it, stylized in neon, in John Wick, the Continental, the High Table, the bounty that turns a whole city into a weapon, excommunicado. Hollywood built an entire mythology around a criminal world with its own laws, its own neutral ground, and its own sanctioned murder. And here is what most viewers never realize. Decades before any of it was written, the American Mafia had already built the real version. It had a board of directors that approved killings. It had a headquarters where salaried killers waited by a phone. It had rules that protected even its enemies, and a mechanism for what happened the moment those protections were withdrawn. The newspapers gave it a name that stuck: Murder Incorporated. This is the story of the real machinery behind the myth. How a contract actually moved from a boss's mouth to a body in a ditch. What the real High Table was, and the night it executed one of its own kings for breaking the rules. Where the real Continental stood, and what was sold at its counter. And how the whole machine was destroyed by one member's voice and avenged through a 6th-floor window. Because here is the question that hangs over everything. John Wick is a fantasy about a criminal world that keeps its word. The real question, the one Abe Reles answers with his life, is what happens in a world exactly like that when the word runs out. Start with the thing the movies get most wrong, which is the noise. In the John Wick universe, a contract is broadcast. Screens light up, phones chime. Every killer in the city gets the name at once. The real system was built on the opposite principle: silence and layers. By the early 1930s, the American underworld had reorganized itself after years of self-destructive war. Above the individual crime families now sat the Commission, a council of bosses created in 1931 to settle disputes, divide territory, and rule on the one question that caused all the wars: who could be killed? That is the piece people miss. The Commission's most important product was not money. It was permission. In that world, murder was not an outburst. It was a license, issued upward of the victim's rank. Killing a made man without approval was itself a capital crime. The High Table is a screenwriter's drawing of something that sat in New York hotel suites, wearing tailored suits and arguing over coffee. And beneath that council, the system needed a workforce. This is where the story arrives in Brownsville, Brooklyn, at the corner of Saratoga and Livonia Avenues, at an all-night candy store called Midnight Roses. Picture it honestly. An elevated train rattling overhead, a counter selling sodas and cigarettes open 24 hours. And in the back, at all hours, a rotating cast of young men from the neighborhood playing cards and waiting for the phone. That candy store was the dispatch office of the enforcement arm that prosecutors and headline writers would later christen Murder Incorporated, a troupe of professional killers drawn mostly from Jewish and Italian gangs of Brownsville and Ocean Hill, kept on call for the national syndicate. This was the real Continental. No chandeliers, no gold coins, no sommelier. Egg creams, linoleum, and men who killed for a living sitting under a candy sign because the entire point of the real underworld was to look like nothing at all. Here is how the machine actually worked, step by step, assembled afterward from courtroom testimony. Step 1, the approval. A boss somewhere in America had a problem, an informer, a rebel, a rival sanctioned by the commission's politics. The request moved up, and if the killing was approved, the contract existed. Nothing written, ever. Step 2, the insulation. The order passed through intermediaries, from bosses to the troop's managers, so that by the time it reached a shooter, the man pulling the trigger often knew little more than a name, a face, and a location. The killers had no motive a detective could ever find, because the motive lived 3 layers above them in another city. Step 3, the import rule. For serious work, killers traveled. Brownsville men handled jobs in other towns, and out-of-town specialists came east, precisely so that no witness could ever connect a local face to a local grudge. Step 4, the craft. The troop's specialists treated murder as a trade with tools and doctrine. Cars were stolen for the job and abandoned. Weapons were disposable and untraceable. Bodies were buried, burned, or dumped, depending on whether the death was meant to be a message or a mystery. Step 5, the payroll, and this is the detail that gave the operation its corporate nickname. By prosecutor Burton Turkis's account, the killers were retained like staff, drawing regular money between jobs, with individual pieces of work paying fees reported in the range of $1,000 to $5,000 plus expenses. Salaried men waiting at a candy store for the phone to offer them work. When Turkis and the writer Sid Feeder later put the story in a book, they estimated the national machine's output across the 1930s at somewhere between 400 and 1,000 murders. The exact number was never established. That is not a gap in the record. That is the point of the design. One more mechanic deserves its place, because John Wick built an entire currency system around it. The gold coins and the markers, favors as money. The real underworld ran on the identical principle without the props. Favors were the actual currency of the syndicate. A boss who borrowed the troupe for a killing owed a debt, payable in territory, in votes at the commission, in a future killing of his own. Sit-downs, the real world's version of the movie's formal parleys, existed precisely to price these debts, held in the back rooms of restaurants and social clubs under rules of safe conduct that were usually honored because a world with no safe rooms cannot do business at all. Men walked into sit-downs beside people who wanted them dead and walked out again. Most of the time, the etiquette was real. So was the fine print underneath it. The management of this troupe traces to 2 names that will run through the rest of this story. Louis Buchalter, called Lepke, a quiet, mild-looking man who was one of the most powerful racketeers in America, master of extortion empires in New York's garment and trucking industries, whose take was estimated in the millions every year. And Albert Anastasia, the Brooklyn waterfront power the press would come to call the Lord High Executioner. Under them, through intermediaries like Louis Capone, worked the Brownsville talent. Abe Rullis, called Kid Twist, a squat, powerful, casually vicious crew boss with a photographic memory. His partner, Martin Goldstein, called Bugsy. Harry Strauss, called Pittsburgh Phil, an immaculate dresser and, by the estimates prosecutors later assembled, possibly the most prolific contract killer in American history, implicated in scores of murders across the country, with serious estimates running past 100. Strauss worked with rope, ice pick, and gun, studied his targets like an accountant, and reportedly took jobs the way other men took overtime. Hold on to relays especially, The machine's destruction is sitting quietly inside his memory. The system worked because everyone in it believed the rules protected them. Bosses were safe from ambitious soldiers because unsanctioned murder meant death. Soldiers were safe from bosses as long as they earned and kept quiet. Even the state, in a strange way, was protected because the commission understood that killing prosecutors, reporters, or civilians brought heat that burned everyone's money. The whole architecture ran on one promise: the rules apply to everybody. And in October 1935, the most volatile boss in New York decided they did not apply to him. What the system did next proved, decades before Hollywood drew its high table, that the real one was deadly serious. Dutch Schultz, the beer and numbers king of the Bronx, was being hunted by a special prosecutor named Thomas Dewey, a crusader building cases that threatened Schultz's entire empire. Schultz went to the commission with a demand that broke every unwritten law at once. He wanted permission to assassinate Dewey. The council heard him out and refused, because killing the most famous prosecutor in America would bring down a war from the government that no racket could survive. Schultz, by the accounts that later reached investigators, announced that he would do it anyway and walked out. Understand what he had just done in the logic of that world. He had declared himself outside the rules. The word the movies would invent for it is excommunicado. The commission's response was not a debate. It was a contract, and the machine processed it like any other order. On the night of October 23rd, 1935, gunmen walked into the Palace Chop House in Newark, New Jersey, and shot Schultz and 3 of his men. Schultz died the next day in a hospital, delirious, while a police stenographer sat by the bed transcribing his final rambling words into one of the strangest documents in crime history. The lesson landed on every wise guy in America. The rules were real, the protection was real, and the moment you stepped outside them, the same system that had guarded you turned into the thing hunting you. Thomas Dewey, the man the mob spared by killing one of its own kings, went on to become governor of New York and nearly president. The underworld had, in effect, made a policy decision about American history. And notice what the Schultz decision reveals about the real hierarchy of fear, because it inverts everything the gangster myth teaches. The most dangerous man in that room was not the loudest killer. It was the accountant logic of the council itself. Schultz had survived shooting wars, rivals, and years of prosecution. What he could not survive was becoming bad for business. In February 1940, Brooklyn authorities under District Attorney William O'Dwyer swept up Reles, Goldstein, and others on murder evidence supplied by informants. Reles sat in custody and did the arithmetic of a man who had personally killed at least 11 people by his own eventual admission, and perhaps as many as 30 by later estimates. The evidence was strong. The chair was waiting, and the organization's protection, the lawyers, the fixed witnesses, the reach into the system was nowhere in sight. So Kid Twist made the call that ended an era. He turned, and when he began to talk, prosecutors discovered what had been sitting behind that candy store counter all along. Reles's memory was a complete, indexed archive of the national murder system. Names, dates, methods, motives, the layered chain of command, the travel, the fees. His information would ultimately help authorities clear some 85 unsolved murders, including the killing of Dutch Schultz. And for the first time, the government could see the machine whole, the commission, the contracts, the troop, Murder Incorporated. Understand also why Reles was uniquely fatal, in a way no wiretap of the era could have been. The insulation system, the layers that protected bosses from their own contracts, had one structural flaw. Somebody had to work in the middle. The men who received orders from above and assigned shooters below were the only people in America who could see both ends of a contract, the boss who wanted it and the hands that did it. Reles was middle management. The layers built to protect the machine had concentrated its entire secret in the memory of a crew boss from Brownsville, and nobody above him had ever considered what would happen if the middle layer decided to save its own life. The commission had planned for every betrayal except the org charts. The convictions came like falling scaffolding. Rilles's testimony sent his own childhood partner, Bugsy Goldstein, and the great craftsman, Pittsburgh Phil Strauss, to the Sing Sing electric chair on June 12, 1941, for the killing of a small-time gambler named Irving Feinstein. Two more troop killers, Harry Mayoni and Frank Abendando, followed in 1942. And the state aimed higher, at Lepke himself, for ordering the 1936 murder of Joseph Rosen, a Brooklyn candy store owner and former garment trucker whom Lepke feared was talking to prosecutors. Note the venue of that murder, because the record has its own poetry. This world ran on candy stores. Lepke by then was already in federal hands through one of the strangest surrenders in American history. In August 1939, after 2 years as the most hunted fugitive in the country, he had given himself up in a parked car to J. Edgar Hoover personally. A meeting brokered by the gossip columnist Walter Winchell, reportedly believing a deal existed that would keep him on federal charges and away from New York's electric chair. No such deal held. And here is where the story returns to the Half Moon Hotel, because by late 1941, Rilles's testimony had one more summit to climb. Albert Anastasia, the co-manager of the troupe. The Lord High Executioner himself, Rilles could tie him directly to murder. No living witness had ever done that. Which brings us back to room 623, the knotted sheets, and the body on the roof below. On the very morning the witness was needed. A later grand jury called it an accident during an escape attempt. The detectives guarding him kept their pensions. The case against Anastasia died on that rooftop. And the men of that world, in their own memoirs and recollections decades later, spoke of the guards being bought as a simple fact of business. What happened in that room has never been legally established. What is established is who benefited. But the window did not save Lepke. Prosecutors still had another insider, Albert Tannenbaum, who had been within earshot when the Rosen contract was given, and his testimony held. Lepke was convicted, and after years of appeals that went all the way to the question of federal versus state custody, Louis Buchalter walked into the Sing Sing death chamber on March 4, 1944, alongside Mendy Weiss and Louis Capone. To this day, Lepke remains the only top-level boss in the history of the American Mafia and its allied syndicate legally executed by the state. The machine's chief executive, processed by a machine bigger than his own, and the ripples ran for decades. William O'Dwyer rode the Murder Incorporated prosecutions to fame and the mayoralty of New York, and spent the rest of his career shadowed by questions about the witness who fell on his watch and the perfect case that died with him. Burton Turkis's courtroom work and his book fixed the story in the American imagination, where it fed every fictional underworld that followed. And Albert Anastasia, the man the window saved, rose exactly as you would fear, seizing control of his family outright in 1951. The system gave him 16 more years than it processed him to. On the morning of October 25, 1957, Anastasia settled into chair number 4 in the barber shop of the Park Sheraton Hotel at 877th Avenue in Manhattan. And 2 gunmen walked in and shot him dead through the hot towels. The hit was never solved. Of course it was not. He had built the reason why. So put the movie and the record side by side, and the honest verdict is this. John Wick is not an exaggeration of the real underworld. It is a translation. The high table existed, and it was called the Commission. And in 1935, it really did execute a king for threatening a prosecutor. The Continental existed, and it was a candy store under the elevated tracks in Brownsville, open all night, killers on retainer in the back. Excommunicado existed, and Dutch Schultz and Abe Rilles and Albert Anastasia each learned its real name, which is simply this: the protection was never yours. It belonged to the system, and the system could take it back between a Tuesday and a Wednesday. The one thing the movies changed is the part that matters most. In the films, the rules are sacred, and the world keeps its word. In the record, the rules lasted exactly as long as they were profitable. The word was a tool, and the safest room in Brooklyn had a 6-story drop outside the window. The real underworld's deepest secret was never the murders. It was that the honor was also a contract, and every contract in that world had the same final clause. If this story hit you, subscribe. Every week we take a famous crime film and dig up the real history underneath it, and the truth is always heavier than the script. Drop a comment. Which movie's underworld should we investigate next?